Abraham Lincoln. The name itself is just monumental, isn't it? But we're going to go beyond the statues and the myths, because behind it all was a real person, a leader who was handed a nation that was literally tearing itself apart at the seams. In this explainer, we're going to look at the man who faced America's greatest crisis and, in the process, totally redefined what the country was all about.
Now get this, 2 years before he was even elected president, Lincoln said this. He saw the storm on the horizon. This wasn't just some clever line for a speech. He was basically telling everyone, folks, we are on the verge of collapsing. It perfectly set the stage for the unbelievable challenge he was about to walk into.
And then he gets elected in November 1860. That house he warned about, it didn't just shake, it started to completely fall apart. The crisis he predicted became a terrifying reality, kicking off the single greatest test the American experiment has ever faced.
Just look at how fast everything collapsed. It's staggering. Before Lincoln even takes the oath of office, 7 states had already packed their bags, said we're out, and formed their own government. By the time shots are fired at Fort Sumter, he's the president of a broken country that's already at war with itself. He didn't just inherit a problem, he inherited a full-blown catastrophe already in motion.
And we have to remember, behind that stoic presidential image was a man carrying a massive personal burden. He suffered from what he called melancholy, what today we'd call severe depression. This wasn't just a reaction to the stress of the job. It was a lifelong battle. So just imagine he's trying to hold a country together while also fighting a war inside his own mind.
So how did this deeply troubled leader navigate the absolute minefield of slavery? Well, to really get it, you have to know what his primary goal was at first. And it wasn't abolishing slavery. It was saving the Union. But his views, well, they were about to change in a really big way.
Just look at this shift. It's incredible. On the left, that's him in 1861, basically trying to calm the South down, saying, I'm not going to touch slavery. Then on the right, just 2 years later, you have the Emancipation Proclamation. So what happened? The war happened. The whole purpose of the war evolved, and Lincoln evolved with it. He came to realize that to save the Union, he had to destroy the very thing that was tearing it apart.
The Emancipation Proclamation was, well, it was a masterstroke, both morally and militarily. On one hand, it declared slaves in the rebel states to be free, turning the war into a fight for human freedom. But strategically, it did something else that was absolutely crucial. It allowed black soldiers to join the Union Army.
And Lincoln himself knew exactly how big of a deal this was. He wrote that the mere sight of 50,000 armed black soldiers would basically end the rebellion on the spot. He understood the incredible psychological blow this would be and the military genius of turning the Confederacy's main source of labor into a powerful army bent on its destruction. But, having a noble cause and more soldiers doesn't automatically win you a war. Lincoln, a civilian president with almost no military experience, now faced a huge problem: winning the actual war. And that meant he had to find a general who would do the one thing that seemed to be unbelievably difficult: actually fight.
I mean, can you imagine the frustration? This question must have kept Lincoln up at night. He's got the men, the factories, all the resources. But his generals, especially George B. McClellan, were just hesitant. McClellan was fantastic at training an army, but he seemed terrified to actually use it. Lincoln famously complained the man had a case of the slows.
Lincoln went through this revolving door of generals: McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, one after another, and they all let him down. And then came Ulysses S. Grant. This guy was different. While other generals were making excuses, Grant was taking cities. Victories at places like Vicksburg and Shiloh showed he had this relentless, aggressive drive that Lincoln had been so desperately looking for.
And this quote just says it all. People would complain to Lincoln about Grant's tactics. They'd whisper about his rumored drinking problem. Lincoln didn't care. He finally had his guy. In Grant, he found a man who understood that you don't win wars by looking good on parade, you win them by fighting. So, with the military situation finally looking up, Lincoln's focus started to shift to the bigger picture. The war couldn't just be about winning. It had to be about creating something better, something more just from all this destruction.
And right here, in just 272 words, at a ceremony on a bloody battlefield, Lincoln redefines the entire American project. He connects the horrible sacrifices of the Civil War all the way back to the promises made in the Declaration of Independence. He's saying this war is a test to see if a nation built on the idea of liberty and equality can even survive.
But beautiful words weren't enough. The Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime order. To kill slavery for good, Lincoln had to change the Constitution itself, and it was a huge fight. It passed the Senate, no problem, but then it failed in the House. So what does Lincoln do? He basically makes it the centerpiece of his re-election campaign. And after he wins, he uses every bit of his political power to get it passed. This was his final, most important mission.
Okay, so the war is winding down, slavery is being abolished for good, and now Lincoln faces his last great challenge. How do you heal a shattered country? How do you piece a nation back together after 4 years of such brutal personal violence?
And his answer is, well, it's maybe his most profound legacy. After all that death and destruction, his plan for putting the country back together wasn't about revenge. It was about mercy. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he called for a peace built on forgiveness, which was a pretty radical idea at the time.
And then, the ultimate tragedy, April 14th, 1865. Just 5 days after the war effectively ends, John Wilkes Booth fires a single shot. The man who wanted to bind up the nation's wounds was gone. And in many ways, his vision for a fair and merciful peace was gone with him.
So in the end, his legacy is just immense. He saved the Union, yes. He abolished slavery, absolutely. But he did more than that. He basically gave the country a second founding, a new birth of freedom that forever changed what America was and what it could be. And that leaves us with this one big, haunting question. His work wasn't finished. The messy, painful process of reconstruction had to happen without his steady hand of mercy. So you have to wonder, what if he had lived? What kind of country would have emerged from those ashes? That's a question we'll never know the answer to, but it's one that's absolutely worth thinking about.